Frames per second, or FPS, is the number of consecutive images displayed on a screen for 1 second. And as you may have noticed if you've been a fan of video games at some point in your life, the higher the number, the smoother the movement of the images on your screen. The question that gives today's video its title is about something most of us have been wondering about since the moment we discovered that playing at 60 FPS was 1,000 times more enjoyable than playing at 30. Or playing at much less, in the case of poor wankers like me who played GoldenEye with 4 players on the Nintendo 64, which in that mode used to hit like 10 frames per second, or the equivalent of the speed of an asthmatic snail. And since the video game market has always orbited around that mythical number of frames per second to sell us ever more advanced consoles and graphics cards, it was logical that at some point this doubt would arise. And if you do a quick search on the internet, you will find all kinds of opinions. Some people argue that it's not worth playing at more than 60 FPS because they say the human eye can't perceive more. Others say that the question makes no sense and that in theory the eye has infinite frames per second. And while in a forum someone says that the normal is to see at 45 FPS, but that military pilots are able to train up to perceive 250, there are others who say that the answer to the question would be the speed of light. And well, it all gets very confusing very quickly. But don't worry, because to solve these kinds of mysteries there is Lulya. The first thing to clarify is that we are not referring to reality as such having a refresh rate as if it were a video game or something like that. There is a speed limit, which is the speed of light, but that is a completely different discussion. Here we are talking about how we perceive that reality, and the question is more about how many frames per second we perceive life through our eyes, which is another question we have to review carefully. In reality, the human eye and a gaming monitor work very differently. While all the screens you see in your day-to-day life simply give us an illusion of motion, putting one image after another quickly, which is in fact what gives rise to this whole frames per second discussion. The eyes perceive the movement of the world around us continuously. You are not taking pictures or static images, but rather various groups of cells in your eyes are capturing the light bouncing off the objects around you in a continuous manner. Thus, this visual information is transmitted to your brain without being separated into images, in a way comparable to how your hearing or your sense of taste does not have a refresh rate that we can measure. But that also doesn't mean that we can say that the eyes see an infinite rate of frames per second. And here comes the tricky part. Cameras are a mechanism with physical limitations, so logically there must be a limit to the amount of visual information our brains can process. There must be, because although the eyes receive visual information continuously, there is a limited number of neurons in the brain and photoreceptor cells in our eyes. But talking about this is much more complex than saying that the human eye has a limit of frames per second and that's it. Surely we all know about fluorescent lights. In my family we used energy-saving bulbs to get a cheaper electricity bill, and I will never forget those fluorescent tubes used to give a gloomy and depressing light in seemingly every university in the world. Well, it happens that these lamps do not give a continuous light, but have a flicker that depends on the frequency of the energy current they use, thus saving energy. This is not very noticeable to the naked eye, but believe it or not, they usually flicker with a frequency of between 50 and 60 times per second, depending on the alternating current of each country. But this flickering light doesn't look flickering, it looks continuous, and that's thanks to the critical flicker frequency, or CFF. Simply put, the term critical flicker frequency refers to the frequency from which a flickering light appears continuous to a human observer. This is not a fixed number and fluctuates between 50 and 90 Hz, depending on the person and many physical and psychological factors. Hertz is, by the way, a measure of frequency per second, and we will be using it a lot in this video. Just remember that 1 Hz equals 1 FPS or 1 frame per second. This is why sometimes fluorescent lights can give some people migraines or epilepsy, but it doesn't mean we're looking at 50 or 90 frames per second and that's it. And the reason is very simple. The CFF effect does not occur in a video camera. Flicker regardless of its speed can be seen, and in fact it causes problems with cameras because the frequency at which it is being recorded, that is, the frames per second of the camera, can collide with the flickering of the fluorescent lamp if one goes faster or slower than the other, and it doesn't look pretty. It is only when you manually synchronize the shutter speed with the frequency of the lights that the banding and crazy flickering effect disappears. Truth be told, when I started researching for this video, I was going to just repeat what others had said on the subject, that yes, we see the world continuously since our eyes are not a camera, but when we see flickering lights or rapidly changing images, like in a video game, this psychological effect comes into play, and that's the end of it. But if we were to see the world in a truly continuous manner, which would be effectively an infinite frame rate per second, we should be able to notice the flickering of light no matter how fast it goes. But that is not the case, as we have just ascertained. And if we were to see a fixed frames per second rate of say 60 frames per second, it should synchronize only when the light flickers 60 times per second. And if the flicker were higher or lower than this frequency, we would suffer the same effect that video cameras suffer with all the banding and crazy flickering, but it's not. We have a speed limit, and there comes a point where we perceive that flickering light as a continuous light, almost as if we had continuous vision, but at the same time we don't. And among all this confusion, I discovered akinetopsia. Akinetopsia is a very rare neurological disorder, and it causes the patient to lose track of the movement of objects in their field of vision. And in fact, the name was proposed only in 1991, in a study written by Samir Seki studying the condition. Yet, I was able to find studies done on patients from the 1980s to the present, and the description is always the same. Instead of seeing a moving object, the patient sees the object in a series of static images, as if it were a movie running at a very slow speed. Too slow judging from patient reports. It seems that the static images change at a speed of about 1 second in the most extreme cases, so living like this must be torture. And because of this, I immersed myself in this research at a level I didn't expect. When you go beyond what everybody says on the internet and you start reading the scientific studies done on whether our vision is continuous or is it subdivided into something analogous to frames per second, the first thing you'll notice is that it's a field of research that is still being studied to this day. It's not really resolved, as I was led to believe in school. There are several theories in progress, and akinetopsia is just one of many arguments in favor of the theory of discrete perception, which postulates that our perception is not really continuous, but that the brain processes what surrounds us using separate samples of information sent by our senses. This theory encompasses all of perception, not just the field of vision, and one of its starting points is that it is a known fact that our neurons are activated by individual sodium, potassium and calcium ions entering and leaving the cell. They are separate packets of information, so physically they cannot be continuous information. Believe me, this video was supposed to be super easy content, but I ended up reading several scientific studies which I'll leave in the description for days, and it's a very deep topic. Another argument in favor of the discrete perception theory comes in the form of the visual trails produced during LSD consumption or as a product of brain damage or some neurological disorder. These trails are described as a series of static images left in the path of moving objects and is a visual effect much like that of multiple exposure stroboscopic photographs, like the ones you see on screen, which clashes directly with the theory of continuous perception, which is what I was taught in school. The main theory, postulated in a study of the year 2011 by Rufin van Rulen and Julien Dubois, is that our brain's motion perception system takes separate samples of the moving object to calculate its trajectory. These samples we do not see in our conscious perception, but the suppression of the samples can fail when there is brain damage, consumption of substances such as LSD, or a neurological disorder, which would perfectly explain visual wakes, akinetopsia, and other similar phenomena, such as the continuous wagon wheel effect, which happens in real life just like on a screen. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and that theory of discrete perception is incredibly interesting. But what we just discussed should be enough to solve the subject of today's video. Or well, almost. First, we need to get back to talking about the CFF. The description I gave you at the beginning about this phenomenon is a pretty basic one. It is a phenomenon that in fact is not even constant. This critical flicker frequency varies depending on your age, mental state, tiredness, fatigue, stress, and many other factors. Animals even have a different CFF than we do, with dogs and cats having a noticeably higher critical flicker frequency than humans, meaning that if you watch a movie at 24 frames per second, your pet is just watching a PowerPoint presentation. And in fact, the initial theory that the limit was between 50 and 90 frames per second is not quite true. There is an excellent study published in the year 2015 by James Davis, Yixuan Xie, and Hongqi Li, which found that the limit was higher, much higher. It turns out that the experiments done to measure CFF were always done with lights or displays that used a single color, such as fluorescent lights. But this does not represent almost any real scenario, not even when you watch a movie, because there the visual stimuli are much higher. What the researchers found is that if you use visual content that requires greater attention and faster eye movements, such as with high-speed video games, the test subjects can perceive the screen flicker up to 500 frames per second. Yes, you heard me right, 500 frames per second, which brings us to a twofold answer. The first part is that the human eye can perceive many more frames per second than what some internet pop-up can tell you. And your video game won't look like real life unless you can get to 500 frames per second. And the second part is that real life doesn't go at 500 frames per second. Not really. What the theory of discrete perception postulates is that, although your eyes receive continuous light, different types of neuronal and photoreceptor cells don't process all the information at the same time. And your nervous system has to process it piecemeal and interpret the motion of objects from individual samples that we don't consciously perceive unless you use LSD. These individual samples are not fixed, and studies subsequent to Van Rullen and Dubois suggest that the brain sampling rate varies depending on the lighting and the speed at which the object is moving. But it is not continuous visual perception, it is just the illusion of one. So I hope you liked this video. It took me a lot more time than expected, and I will leave you in the description a lot of very interesting studies that I used for the research. That although I tried to keep it short, it turned out to be longer than I thought. Anyway, I remind you that although I am a good researcher, I am not a qualified scientist, and if you want to know more about the subject, it is best that you read these scientific articles before asking any questions to a guy who makes videos on the internet. Either that, or write to Rufin van Rullen. That man has been researching and publishing papers on discrete perception theory for at least 15 years, and I'm sure he knows a hell of a lot more than I do. So, with nothing more to say, remember to rest your eyes from time to time, and I'll see you in the next video.